Welcome to the Power Tribe Network.
Just Keep Living to me now means I get it. And one of the things about Just Keep Living is that I wanted to have a place where people would feel safe. It really isn't enough to be right. You have to be effective. And you'll learn that the more breaths that you take, the more grace that you're given, the more opportunities that you have to just keep living. Just Keep Living with Marva Hanks.
So we welcome our listeners today to another episode of Just Keep Living. It's a phrase that my father used to tell me as I had to catch up to his wisdom and not knowing everything, but he knew the personality that I was, and he would tell me often, just keep living. So we welcome our listeners in today as we're going to have access to one of the great minds of the nonprofit world, Mr. Eric Fellman. So Eric, I'm so grateful that you could come back, and thanks for always reaching out when you're in town.
Oh, it's great to be here. And I'm just thrilled that in our circles of life, God had them connect.
Right. And so we connected through a class. I signed up for a nonprofit class that you were giving at Gateway, and got some great, rich information from there. But the best thing I think that came out of that time was a ongoing relationship, friendship.
I 100% agree. I love the fact that Gateway offers me the opportunity to give that class. But the best things that happen for me are the different groups that really come forward, kind of latch onto the ideas and create new ways of serving people and getting the gospel message out that I would have never imagined. And I get to have a piece in setting them on their journey.
So you either set them on their journey or you sabotage them. So I remember saying,
that's right.
Here you said in the class, the beginning, that you want to dissuade as much as possible. So if we get through the class and we still want to go ahead with the nonprofit, then we'll go with God's speed.
Yeah, I remember, I think I had forgotten that you were a starter nonprofit at the time, because there's a class I teach for ongoing nonprofits to raise their management capacity.
Right.
But Gateway said, all these people come to us and they want to start something, and not even half of them really should start something. I said, okay, we can deal with that.
Right.
But like you said, somebody who's the passion's in their heart, and they get over the tough stuff we talk about that it takes to start and why not to start a nonprofit. Half the people don't come back the second week because they were doing the things to not do. It's amazing what comes out of that. And you are the most amazing one of those we've given that class once so far. And, and I really love our friendship. I love the fact that we've gotten to be able to get to know you guys as a couples and know what God's doing in your lives.
Right. So I was there on behalf of DRA Lending, which is still in the startup phase, but we're making traction. I think we've taken great philosophies from the class to enter into the community in a way that helps and doesn't hurt. So I appreciate your feedback and you being utilized as a resource for us. But what I wanted to talk about today was you have got to walk along some fabulous, exciting journeys with some wonderful people that have transitioned on to heaven, and some are still here. But so for 12 years, you worked for?
I worked for Dr. Norman Vincent Peale for the last 12 years of his life. I went to work for him when I was 30, and he was 84. And I always say that for about 6 years, he wore me out. And when he turned 90, I started to be able to keep up with him.
Wow.
He was an amazing person, started as a simple Methodist preacher. And sometime around the end of the Second World War, he noticed especially men were leaving the church, the discouragement of such devastation they saw around the world. They just said, I'm not sure about God. I went over there and didn't see him. He would hear that a lot when he would talk to men. And so he began to write, and he got on the radio very early, and he was one of the first preachers on TV. He would do anything to get outside the walls of the church. And he wrote that famous book that called The Power of Positive Thinking. I still think of how amazing it was. It sold 30 million copies. And you know a bit about the publishing world and the public world in general. Any book that sells 50,000 is going to make the New York Times bestseller. A book that sells 1 million are very few and far between. And 30 million is unbelievable.
Right.
And that gave him a platform and influence. And during those years, I got to walk with him and follow him around, carry his bags, and administer some of his programs. It connected me to a lot of interesting people. My kids, I have 3 sons, course, they have to get their father in his place. And so they say, Dad, you just Forrest Gumped your way through life.
There we go. There we go.
And because you were following Dr. Peale around. So
right. So give us another one of those snapshots. I know I had you come and speak to our mastermind group a couple of months ago, but one story that stuck with me as you were carrying Dr. Peale's briefcase along with a military personality of today that we are all familiar with. So tell us a little bit about that.
So it was during General Colin Powell's active service. He was in the Pentagon, and Dr. Peale had the idea that heroes of our nation needed to be recognized, whether they were getting an Academy Award or not. There ought to be an Academy Award for goodness. That was his way of saying it. And his first selection was General Colin Powell for how he had led the nation through that period of time. So because he received the award, we were invited to his office and get some pictures. And so I literally was carrying the briefcase, and Dr. Peale was, 90 years old. And we're walking down these wide corridors, and there's like 5 colonels along with the general, carrying his stuff. And the general noticed that one of Dr. Peale's shoes was untied. Now, the first thing about that is that was my job. And somehow I was looking at the general, not at my principal. And he stopped, knelt down in front of all of his colonels, and tied Norman Vincent Peale's shoe in the hallway of the Pentagon.
Wow.
And he got up, and the guy next to me goes, "Oh, man, we're going to hear about that." And I said, "What do you mean?" He says, "Because we all stood there, and he's the one who noticed it. But because he's that kind of man, we'll all follow him to hell and back."
Right.
And it was just, I still get chills thinking about it.
Right.
That's who he was. He wasn't putting on a show. There were no cameras. That's just who he was.
Right.
And that's why he was one of those wonderful people that Norman said should get America's Award, not the Academy Award, but America's Award.
Right.
And that was a great moment.
Servant leadership shown with just deep humility and meekness. I love hearing stories about great men like that. Those are the stories that we need to hear more about. The other thing, I'm sure that you can go on nonstop, and I love it, and that's why we're here today, is give us another snapshot of a Forrest Gump moment that comes to mind for you.
This one was more recent. I'm involved a little bit in the National Prayer Breakfast, which is put on by the Congress every year, and they use lay volunteers like myself to organize groups of people, because 3,000 people show up. So let's have a group of business people and a group of people from Illinois and a group of people from all the other 49 states. And I'm involved in the group of business people. And one of those persons is the former governor of South Carolina. So we were meeting at his ranch in South Carolina to plan this next session. And his phone rang, and the current governor of South Carolina at the time, which was Nikki Haley, called him and said, "We're taking down the Confederate flag tomorrow, and I want you to be there." And he, we didn't know this. There's 5 of us sitting there, and he hung up the phone and says, "Guys, I asked you all to fly down here. Something's happening tomorrow. You got to tell me whether I can do it or not." And we said to him, "You need to do this." His name is David Beasley. And he told us the backstory that he was elected with an overwhelming majority, was having a great time as governor, but it began to rise up in his heart that this was wrong. He showed up at the Capitol every day, and the Confederate flag was flying over the Capitol. And he said, "It's history, but it shouldn't be the top symbol of our state." And he started to speak that out. Well, he was a Republican, and the Republicans didn't like that.
Wow.
And they voted him out big time just 3 months later. And she knew, Nikki, that had happened to him. And so she successfully got it voted and passed, whatever, to get it taken down. But she reached out and said, "You need to be there because you led the way. You blazed the trail to make this change that can heal our state." And so what we said to him was, "You can go, but we get to go with you."
Right.
So if you watch the national news that night, there's Nikki Haley and Dave Beasley and all of their congressional leaders of the state and the state police and a lot of ministers, a lot of different society standing on the 3rd step up from the Capitol as they bring this flag down and send it off to a museum. But 14 steps up, there's a little row of 4 guys.
There we go.
And we're standing behind that,
Witnesses.
getting to see that moment of history. which again, those kind of things, we don't talk about that.
Right.
We don't talk about it. I used to be in the news business years and years ago, so I understand that news is the bad stuff. And the reason good stuff isn't news, because it's not uncommon. But something like that was very special. And like I said, it did make the news. But there should be more of those things that we celebrate about what pulls us together instead of the things that we're different in.
So you brought it up about the news, and so that you were in the news business. Share more about that, as we have a wave in our culture of the fake news. So you have any thoughts about that?
Well, I went to journalism school at the University of Wisconsin, which is still the number 1 or 2 journalism school in the country.
Big 10 school,
and
University of Iowa.
And I, had all the toughness of those courses. I actually graduated with honors because I loved it, not because I'm that good, but when you love something, you get good at it. And we were taught that you didn't take a side. And so the difference to me, I don't call it so much fake news, but it's slanted news.
Okay.
People taking a side, which isn't what news is supposed to be. It's not what I was taught news was supposed to be.
So you were taught?
I was taught that you should present the facts, and you shouldn't eliminate some facts that are inconvenient to your point of view. I recognize at journalism schools today, because I've read a lot about this, they teach young people, you should pick a point of view and go into journalism to present your point of view.
Wow.
And when I went to school, and what I think is better journalism is you listen to all the points of view and put up what they say and let the people decide. And so I don't use the term fake news. I use the term slanted news, because you've just picked your own point and left everything else off.
Wow.
And whether you want to go to the right or the left, they're both doing it to the detriment of all the rest of us. Because as you know, Marva, none of us are, some people are, but the majority of Americans are not far on the left or far on the right. We're trying to find friendships in the middle.
Unity.
And we can't do that when someone's screaming in our ear from these two sides, making us feel like everything's broken.
Right.
Because everything isn't broken. I mean, what did we see upstairs just now? A whole system of getting people into entrepreneurship and success that's definitely not broken.
Right. So for our listeners, we visited Dallas Designing Dreams, and it was Eric's first time with being exposed to the founder, Arthur Porter. And I'm glad that you had the same sense of purpose and fulfillment that I've seen since I've been exposed to it. But I want to segue back to your definition of stating just the facts, because as we're Christ followers, we're both believers. I've been studying a little bit of Acts, and the things that we're witnessing now in the culture are no different than what the early Acts church experienced.
Right.
And so I remember that when Peter was getting pushback from participating with the Gentiles, and what he was led to do to go back and tell leadership was stating the facts about Christ's death, him being the Messiah. He just stated the facts, to your point, and then let the people decide what they would, on if they would receive the facts or if they would reject the facts. So I think that we're still in a culture that is inundated with, if we're going to receive the truth when it's presented to us, or if we're going to reject it.
And Jesus himself said, people are going to make both choices. He said, some of these I'm a stumbling block to some of them.
Right.
And to some of them, I'm the glory of God.
Right.
But the people decide, as opposed to gathering groups of people and forcing them into a certain opinion, or condemning someone's opinion just because it's different than your own.
Right.
Which is something we're seeing, more and more in our society. I don't like you because you support this side.
Right.
And so I'm going to do even, throw something at you or boo you or, whatever it is.
Right.
And that, to me, that divides our society. But of course, as believers, we're not surprised by that.
No, shouldn't be.
Because that's Satan's work.
You're listening to Just Keep Living with Marva Hanks.
Right.
And the trouble is, we're just all giving him a foothold.
Right.
And I have to start with myself and say, that statement the other day by so-and-so riled me up. Why did that rile me up? Number one, I shouldn't be surprised.
Self-check.
Number two, my response should be, if that's a wrong statement, I should pray for that person because they got it wrong.
Right.
If I think I'm so right, not the response of getting riled up about it.
Right.
And yet we seem to be defaulting as a society to getting riled up instead of finding the other ways to respond.
So I'm going to go back to your time with Dr. Norman Vincent Peale, and we're in this culture now. What do you think he would say about the time that we're living in with the news, the slant of the news and the division? And do you think?
You know, he was a very interesting character. Something that's little known about him is he got trapped by this very thing. It was happening back then.
Back then would be
1960. When was JFK elected? 60, right? So 1959 and early 60.
Okay.
And most people may not even think about this anymore, but JFK was a Catholic.
Yes.
And there was this thing that if you're Catholic, you're going to be first loyal to the Pope and second loyal to the United States, right? And so the Protestants were getting together worrying about this. And it was as fake news, if you want to call it that, or slanted news, as I call it, as ever, right? So Norman got invited to a meeting by a famous religious personality that he respected, and he was a bit naive. And so he didn't know the purpose of the meeting. Turns out the person that invited him decided not to show up because he saw the purpose was getting louder and louder. Norman walks in not knowing the purpose, and he's now the most famous person in the room. So they appointed him chairman. And then the speeches started happening about what the group should do, and it was all anti-Kennedy.
Wow.
And he's now chairman. So it gets reported in the New York Times that Norman Vincent Peale, chairman of this group, made this proclamation, which he had nothing to do with other than he should have said, no, I don't want to run for chairman. I don't want to be appointed chairman. And he would have probably walked out when he started to hear what was being said, but now he's stuck. He's in the center chair up on the stage, and all this stuff is happening around him. It really crushed him because he took huge criticism from many parts of society for promoting such division, because it was happening then, but people didn't like it, and they really spoke up. Today, we don't speak up when we don't like it. And so he actually resigned from his famous church.
Wow.
They wouldn't accept it, but he was so crushed that he resigned because he had been used in one of these fake news situations. So
I think people are prone to that more and more today because of the facade that's so easily made and manufactured in our culture now. Everybody has a phone on there and access to video on their phones to even just promote a facade. And so that's unfortunate. But he carried on.
He carried on. He went out in the press and said, I was wrong. People should vote their heart and mind and conscience for one of these two candidates. And he really retreated from public life for a while. We don't really recall, because I was in grade school when Kennedy was elected, right? So I wasn't aware of what's going on in society. But he was like a rock star phenomenon. People would fill Madison Square Garden to hear him speak, and to buy his books.
Right.
I remember he one time went on a tour with Roy and Rogers and Dale Evans, who were these famous TV personalities, and Los Angeles Coliseum, 100,000 seats, was completely full.
To hear somebody speak.
And he just stopped doing that. He just retreated from saying yes to stuff like that for about 2 years. It was shortly after that time that he just rededicated himself to proclaiming his message, which what he said to me later was, I said, what was that period of time? Now I'm 30 and I'm working for him. What was that period of time like for you? I see the pain, because he wrote about it in his autobiography.
Right.
He said, well, I just took a look at the master. And people criticize me for telling stories. He was a great storyteller. That's why I'm a little bit of a storyteller.
Yeah.
And he said, and the master never spake to them save by parables, which is a short little quote out of the King James Version, And he said, if it's good enough for Jesus, it was good enough for me. So I always tell stories. The second thing is, I looked at what society was like when Jesus walked the earth.
Right.
The Romans were horrible. I mean, they were Stalin on steroids, which was the person he thought of as the most evil person in the world. He said, Jesus never spoke out against Caesar once.
Wow.
He never spoke out against Rome once. He went to the people and said, the only thing that matters is your heart to God, your heart to God. The rest of the things will take care of themselves. And not so much that Jesus said those words, but that's how he acted. And he said, I decided after that failure in my life of getting representing and causing concern and upsetting people and myself, that I was just going to do what Jesus did, which is stand up for what the message was. The biography about him is called God's Salesman. He said, so when people will ask me to take a stand, I say, I'm sorry, I'm in sales. That's management's deal.
Wow, there we go.
Talk to the manager.
So watch me connect the dots from that time until now, 2019.
I'm ready.
There's somebody that fills stadiums and they have made their money. They're renowned for their rap style and all that. A lot of controversy. Kanye West.
Ah, yeah. So I can't tell you I've paid a lot of attention to that, except I notice that he's talking about Jesus.
There we go.
And I will tell you this, Norman used to have this thing that he would say, so I'll tie it back around again, okay? So these men especially back in the 50s who said, I'm done with church and I can't stand Christianity. He'd hear that once in a while, right? So he'd say, well, Jesus wasn't a Christian.
Right.
And if you really wanted to get to him, he'd say, he was a Jewish rabbi.
Come on. Right.
So he'd say, so it's not about religion. It's about your relationship with this person. And I think anytime somebody gets a platform and they say that simple message, is your life messed up? You've tried everything else. How's it working for you?
Right.
You know what Jesus had to say? It's this. This is the simple message of Jesus about loving God and loving your neighbor.
Right.
You can't love your neighbor unless you love God, because your neighbor looks ugly unless you're looking through God's eyes. And you can't love yourself. You know, I always, with the roots of positive thinking, which he took criticism for not calling it faith or whatever, he used this phrase, positive thinking. It was in when that verse says, love your neighbor as yourself. You can't love your neighbor unless you can love yourself. And you can't love yourself unless you know you've been forgiven by God. And oh, by the way, Jesus came to hand you that forgiveness. Facts. It's simple facts. And anybody who lifts that up to the extent that he's lifting that up in his music or what he's talking about, Kanye is tapped into that. Now, can you twist that? Can you become, there's a film back when I was a kid called Elmo Gantry, and later The Apostle with, who's the famous actor, Robert Duvall. Okay. And about a preacher who travels from town to town and hoodwinks people out of their money, you know. You can do that. Right. You can use Jesus' name and hoodwink people out of their money. Even St. Paul said some people are doing it out of strife and vainglory, but they're still saying the name. And that's the name that one day every knee will bow and every tongue confess. Right. I had my sort of political time in my 50s where we got to change this. The word's going down. We got to elect the right people, you know, and I engaged in some of that. And the answer is Jesus already won. And we're in a cleanup, and sometimes a cleanup's messy. Right. You know, I remember some of my ancestors, uncles, were in the European theater, right? So they declared the end of the war, but not all the Germans found out. And there's incidents that not all the Japanese found out, right? So you'd come across this cell that was still fighting, right? There was still stuff going on that you had to clean up. But that's where we are. And if we take that perspective, number one, that person who drives me nuts because I just can't understand why they think communism's a good idea, or, you know, something that really sets people off. That makes me say, boy, they just don't know yet. The war's been won. I got to tell them the war's been won. They can lay down their arms. Right. And instead of, I got to stop them from what they're doing. Right. I got to give them the good news. Yeah. I feel that in that season now that the movie Harriet Tubman is coming out Friday. Oh. But I have since I've been experiencing more and more freedom and understanding what salvation is and how I have been set so truly free, is that I'm going back to tell more people. It's just giving me a new vigor, a new dose of boldness, if you will, to go back and set the captives free. Yeah. I always want to ask anyone that we have on our podcast, and so grateful that you are a Christ follower, but we do have conversations with all walks of faith. But, but can you tell us your salvation story for our audiences and for your sons? And so I'm very boring. You know, in my background, we call that the testimony. What's your testimony, right? So mine's very boring. I was born on Easter Sunday to a family that loved God. And my mother decided that when I was a week old, I could squawk in church just as much as in at home. So she took me and put me in the nursery. So I've been attending church since, the second Sunday after Easter in 1954. And raised believing. I don't have a big story of going away from the faith into sex, drugs, rock and roll and all that. But I do have a story of not letting it touch the inner core of my life. Okay. It became the thing I was, like I'm a Minnesotan, I like to canoe, it's a fact about me, but it hadn't soaked into me until married the love of my life. We spent 25 years married, raised 3 kids, a new piece of life came to us and we were invigorated by it. We had moved to actually Washington, D.C., not to work in government, but to work in a nonprofit that was in the area. And my wife went to a session and came home and after 25 years told me I was sexually abused when I was a kid and I never told you and I need to tell you.
Wow.
And I've been released tonight of all that's affected me.
Wow.
And that drove me to say, I didn't know my wife carried that pain. I wasn't paying, a believer would have been paying it, a believer who let it soak in and didn't wear it as clothes.
And how old were you?
I was 21 plus 25. I was 46 years old.
For sure.
And what gave me tears was I let, 40 years go by like that. But what gave me hope was the immense change when I just said, Jesus, if you did something like that for my wife, you got to do something for me. Because I don't have that kind of pain, but I haven't let you in like she just let you in.
Wow.
And that's the biggest story of my faith walk.
Well, I think it's important for all of our listeners to know that everyone's journey to Jesus is varied.
Yes.
There's only one way to God, that's through Jesus Christ, but there's a lot of
There are 7 billion paths to Jesus.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. So I thank you for that, and just always so grateful, Eric, that we get these monthly dates.
I love this.
And that Joy allows that, your lovely bride of Joy, that she allows you to come and spend, if it's in half an hour or an hour that I get with you, that I am truly a thief in this relationship on the receiving end of being involved with you.
You know my thoughts about that. We're stealing from each other.
Right.
The people and the parts of life that you've introduced me to are really good for me to know and keep me ever wanting more of God, to know and open up more of myself. So thank you.
Right. All right, brother. We thank you, and we thank our handsome producer, Walter Johnson Jr., for taking the time to record us so professionally and so with the spirit of excellence on the top side of South Side of Dallas. We thank you for this time, and we're grateful for the listeners. Everyone at some point in their lives will have to settle the matter of disappointment, whether in people or circumstances. Choose to receive His grace to influence your next step. Just keep living with Marva Hanks.
Sign up and be a part of the team. Be a Podotron at Podotron.com. Thank you for listening to Podotron.